happened. And even today, you can hear that in a lot of the rhetoric on the left, where you talk about structural racism or the kind of intrinsic racism of whiteness, or whiteness as a inevitable accompaniment to simply the skin color that you're born with. And I think, that is quite deeply offensive to a lot of white people that are really not fundamentally racist.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Lockdown TV from Unheard. Today we are joined from Stanford in California by Professor Francis Fukuyama, one of the world's foremost political scientists and a chronicler of our age. Can you hear me and see me, Professor?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
Very good. I have been spending the last few days immersing myself in your canon, in the oeuvre, and I have so many things that I'd like to discuss. But I thought, since we are pretty much exactly 1 week away from an election, let's just fast forward 1 week as a point of departure. And let's imagine that we wake up on Wednesday morning and find that Donald Trump has lost. I'm not saying that's going to happen. We don't know. But let's just presume, for the sake of argument, the polls are right. What will you be feeling if that is true?
Well, first of all, I'll be feeling very delighted. I think it's extremely important that Biden win this election. I think a really resounding rejection of Trump and Trumpism is going to be necessary to heal some of the divisions and real, terrible problems that have emerged in this country as a result of the last 4 years. Even if Biden wins, however, we're still really not out of the woods for a number of reasons. One is that the underlying polarization will not have gone away. And indeed, the polarization has gotten to the point where, the president has been contesting the legitimacy of any election that he loses. He has a lot of supporters. Some of them are armed, that he's advised to go to the polling places, and there may be violence or incidents that will mar the election itself. It's going to take a long time to count all of the mail-in ballots, whose volume this year has been really extraordinary because of the COVID epidemic. And we actually could be in a prolonged crisis over who actually won the election that will persist for some days and weeks after November 3rd. So that's one hurdle that we have to get over. Even if the election is decided fairly peacefully, and there is a transition of power, Biden is going to face a lot of challenges because, one issue we'll have to see on November 3rd is whether the Democrats take control of the Senate. If they don't, he's going to face the same problem Obama faced in the last few years of his presidency, where he really can't get anything done because the Republicans will, resist anything that he tries to do legislatively. Even if he wins, he still is not going to have the kind of majority that would be needed to pass really difficult legislation. And there's also going to be a big gap that will open up between the left wing of the Democratic Party and centrists like Biden. And that's a fight that has been kept under wraps up until this point because everybody's so interested in getting Trump out of power. But once Biden wins, that fissure will open up, and that's something that Biden will have to deal with.
Will you feel in any way sad that this 4 years has come to an end, or that this kind of this breach has ended in this way, if indeed it does?
No, not at all. I think, most of us that follow politics closely are totally exhausted by the last 4 years because, every single day has brought some new controversy that really shouldn't be happening. And I think that the feeling on the part of me and a lot of other people is that it would be nice if politics could return to being just kind of routine and boring, and then we could actually pay attention to other issues other than the coming election and the latest thing that the president tweeted. So I'm not going to regret the passing of this era at all.
I'd like to kind of see if I can challenge that a little bit with reference to your work. Let's zoom out the full kind of 30-year spectrum and return, first of all, to the book that made you a kind of world-famous name, The End of History. That is a much misunderstood book, and we recently published an essay on Unheard that said why Francis Fukuyama was right all along. So fear not, I'm not going to attack you on those grounds exactly. In fact, as a child of the 90s and 2000s, I feel like the end of history did happen in a way, and the atmosphere growing up during that period was very much like you described it, with the kind of liberal democracy being the pretty much uncontested model, and there being a kind of a lack of drama. And yet, as well as it being a diagnosis of a particular ideology, you also kind of investigated and pointed out the weaknesses in it, particularly in the last section of that book. Tell us a little bit about that, the fears that you had about the weaknesses of the system.
Well, the full title of the book was The End of History and the Last Man. The last man is a phrase that comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, who basically posited that at the end of history, meaning with the realization of a modern liberal state, you would have a lot of dissatisfaction because there was a part of the human personality that demanded, recognition and dignity. And if everybody was just into, stable consumerism, the latest iPhone, that would not satisfy the highest aspirations of people, that people really wanted to struggle. And if history was over in the sense of all the big questions being answered, they wouldn't like that. And that's really, I think, the basis for, my speculation way back in 1992 that eventually we'd get to the point where people would rebel against the stability and consensus that existed in a modern society and demand something more. And I think, we've, in a way, seen that evolve, that people do want recognition, not just of themselves as citizens, equal citizens in a peaceful liberal state. They want other things. They want recognition of their membership in particular groups, particularly if they are mistreated or marginalized in some sense. They want to be members of nations, and not just some bland, universal, citizen of the world. They want to have their religion recognized, so there are many things that will drive people to rebel against the prosperity and peace of a modern liberal state. And I think that's really what we've seen arise especially with the emergence of populism in many countries, including Britain and the United States.
Just to be a bit even more technical, you actually see this as a question of the soul, ultimately. There's a particular part of the soul, as described by Socrates, called thymos, which is a kind of desire for recognition and the spiritedness. Tell us about that.
Well, in the Republic, Socrates has this conversation where he asks his followers, are there really not three parts of the soul? So everybody recognizes we have desires. So that's eros, that's the desiring part of the soul. There's reason that calculates. And actually, those two together constitute the human nature that economists understand, because they say human beings are rational utility maximizers. They just have all these preferences and they use their brains to try to maximize those. But Socrates, 2,500 years before the rise of modern economics, said, isn't there this third part called thymos? And that's the part that desires recognition of one's inner dignity. And I think that what's happened in the centuries, up to the present, is that in Western thought, particularly, this idea that we all have these hidden inner beings that have worth and that demand recognition is an idea that has become almost universal, and that becomes the motor for a lot of politics. So you think about Catalonia right now, or Scotland, right? That these are territories that are parts of stable, pretty effective democracies, but that's not enough because both Catalans and many Scots feel that we actually have a deeper identity that is more narrowly, circumscribed by our language and our particular historical traditions. That is not being recognized. We don't have a seat at the UN, or we don't have an independent voice as a international player. And so you get this demand for the recognition of, these hidden identities, or previously hidden identities. And I think that's really at the basis of a lot of nationalism, but also, of the what we call identity politics that exists in, modern democracies, where, women, gays and lesbians, racial minorities all, have this similar feeling of their group being undervalued.
Which strikes me as deeply true, and actually is a better explanation for the kind of populist revolts of 2016 and more recent than many of the economic explanations, I would say. I mean, do you see it that way, that somehow this kind of globalized, technocratic, capitalist kind of world order that had developed during that end of history period in some way was inadequate to part of our souls, and that is in part what led to the populist uprisings?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I don't think it was disconnected from the economic explanation, because, as globalization progressed, many people did not see their situations improve. They lost jobs, especially men in traditional manufacturing and relatively low-skill parts of the economy saw their jobs fleeing to China and, other parts of the developing world. And when you lose a job, it's also a loss of status. That a job means that society values you enough to pay you a certain salary. And then if you're unemployed for an extended period, you feel worthless. And it, I think, provokes an intense feeling of anger that somebody is doing this to you. And I think this is really one of the triggers for populism, that it's very easy to blame this on foreigners, on immigrants, on various people that are taking something from you. And the most important thing they're taking, it is resources, but it's also dignity, because, you're finding yourself being sucked down into a, underclass. And I think that's really, at the core of a lot of the, the people that have voted for populist politicians.
I mean, of course, before the election of Trump, we had Brexit here in the UK earlier that year. And a famous quote of yours from that first book, I'm just going to read it out. It says, "The end of history will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands." It does sound a little bit like a kind of European Union summit circa 2014. So we then had this Brexit revolt against that sad world that you describe so poetically. Why was that a bad thing?
Well, in a sense, the European Union succeeded a little bit too well. It was really created because of all of the bloody nationalism that consumed Europe for the first half of the 20th century. And it was deliberately designed to actually replace nationalist aspiration with economic well-being. And, it succeeded in large measure in doing that. But again, that wasn't really sufficient, I think, to satisfy people's aspirations, because they really do want to be recognized as people who struggle for higher causes, or have, other things other than job security in mind. And so I think, and it's particularly interesting in Eastern Europe, because this was a part of the world that had lived under authoritarian or totalitarian dictatorship for a generation. And I think the generation that came out of that struggle against dictatorship was very happy to join the European Union because that meant modernity, that meant freedom. They could say what they wanted, they could come and go in ways they couldn't under communism. But their children that grew up after 1989 or 1991, sort of took that world for granted. So, of course, we can travel anywhere we want in Europe. And actually, we want to move to Germany or to Britain because, we don't like our job situation in Bulgaria or Serbia or wherever they were. And I think that taking for granted of that liberal modernity was then what paves the way for other aspirations to be recognized for other sorts of things.
What I'm kind of getting at is what seems to me a kind of central tension or even contradiction, because you, more than almost any other writer, really seems to kind of appreciate the populist urge, or appreciate those urges in the soul that lead to populist governments. And yet you're so censorious of them. You single out Poland and Hungary all the time as these threats to liberal democracy. And of course, Trump, you don't have a single nice word to say about. So how can you explain that contradiction?
I don't think it's a contradiction because when I think, for example, just to take the kind of white working class voters that voted for Trump, you have to disaggregate that group because they're operating out of a number of different motives. And so I think that there is a really legitimate core to the unhappiness they have with elites, because the elites in the United States, along with those in the European Union, did support this liberal international order that got them out of a job. This was the order that led all these jobs to flee to Asia and other parts of the developing world. And so that aspect where, those same elites said, this is good for everybody and it'll be good for you too, simply failed. They didn't compensate those people that had lost out on globalization. And so they have a right to be angry. And then there's a cultural element to that where there is a kind of, snobbery or disdain that people who are well educated and live in big urban agglomerations like London or New York or San Francisco have for people that aren't like them. And so that part of it, I think, is perfectly right. And there are things like the opioid epidemic that had been raging for, a number of years that really hadn't been covered in the mainstream media because it wasn't happening to, the kind of college-educated people that a lot of the media barons were familiar with. So that part of it, I think, is legitimate. But, the trouble is that demand for recognition, then veers off into kind of old-fashioned prejudice. And in the United States in particular, because of our racial history, it's taken on, a real racial dimension where, I think some of the resentment against elites is really kind of racially based, that people are kind of nostalgic for, a period where white people were if you thought of an American, it was a white person. And now, that's been changing very rapidly. Something very similar is going on in Britain. And I think that that's less legitimate because I think identity has really shifted, away from that kind of racial definition.
Do you not think you're being guilty slightly of that same snobbery that you talked about, where because there's a kind of distaste around these kind of majoritarian movements, that it's sort of tinged with danger? But if your original thesis is right, and I think it is, that the world we were offering these people was fundamentally inadequate, and they felt, literally part of their souls was being denied, that is an emergency that needed to be fixed. And it was an intolerable situation.
Well, yeah, but it depends on the way that you categorize that in the intolerableness. And I think that if you substituted class for race, then that would be fine. If you said we have a real class problem in the United States or in Britain, where people with only a high school education really have gotten the short end of the deal, and we need to take care of them and make sure they're included in the community. I think that is perfectly fine. And but that's not what's actually happening in a couple of respects. So you do really now have, I think, an increasingly overt rise of white nationalism in the United States. I really didn't think this was possible after the civil rights era, but it's been coming back. But also, it feeds off of the left-wing identity politics, in which the left has also lost its connection to class. Right in the 20th century, the left-wing agenda was all about the proletariat, and the proletariat in virtually every European country was majority white. It was the dominant ethnicity in that country. But that agenda has shifted over the last couple of generations, beginning in the 1960s, so that inequality is not understood as a general class phenomenon, but it's understood as the injustices that are done to very specific and much narrower groups, women, racial minorities, immigrants, gays and lesbians, the disabled, and so forth. And I think that this is something I got a lot of pushback from when I published my last book, Identity, because I said that there's actually a connection between the left-wing and the right-wing forms of identity politics. Most of the pushback coming from people on the left that said, well, what are you talking about? These people simply want equality. But I do think that, this definition of injustice as predominantly being done to these very specific groups that didn't seem to include, white people, for example, I think was the cause of a lot of resentment. And even today, you can hear that in a lot of the rhetoric on the left, where you talk about structural racism or the kind of intrinsic racism of whiteness, or whiteness as a inevitable accompaniment to simply the skin color that you're born with. And I think, that is quite deeply offensive to a lot of white people that are really not fundamentally racist. And so you have this interplay between the left and right-wing versions of, identity that I think is very unhealthy for democracy. So that's why I'm all in favor of, getting back to a class-based rather than a kind of gender, race, identity-based politics.
We have then a world that let's say, 5 years ago, looked much more settled still in the kind of dying years of that end of history period. But there were aspects of it that people found fundamentally unsatisfactory. And we've had these series of rebellions. Isn't that quite a beautiful thing in a way? I mean, should we not, whilst being kind of careful about the ability of these passions to turn in a dangerous direction, also be very careful not to try and put them back in their box and not to and go back to that world?
No, I definitely think that's true. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really driven by legitimate resentments that people have about the way that the old liberal, both national and international order were structured. And I think that we're never, for example, I don't think that anyone wants to go back to the kind of heyday of globalization where, a company would outsource jobs seeking, the tiniest little efficiency advantage. If that ended up screwing a lot of their workers and that was fine, they just do that. I mean, I think that that's something that really needs to be rethought. And similarly, I think the cultural, you would even say cultural imperialism of a lot of the elites is something that, really I think needs to be investigated. And quite frankly, I think people are probably more aware of that gap, between elites and ordinary people than they were before the rise of Donald Trump. And so that's all to the good. But I do think that it's important that, we've got a big reform agenda that needs to be put in place. And I do think that it's really important that whatever we do going forward is one that, is conscious of these both resentments and kind of legitimate claims. So, for example, this is all very abstract, but let me give you a concrete example having to do with immigration. If you look at poll data in the United States, it's actually not that different from Canada, where about 70% of Americans think that immigration has been a good thing. But there is a lot of unhappiness about the fact that we don't control immigration, that so much immigration is illegal and we don't seem to have a way of stopping that. And so I think that a policy that would take account of the resentments that a lot of Americans have is one that would say, yes, we like immigrants, we profit from them, we don't mind diversity in itself, but the government ought to be, able to make a decision on who gets to enter the country, and that should be done legally. And that would satisfy, I think, the legitimate unhappiness with the current system, which is the fact that we're not in control, but it would not cater to a kind of xenophobic prejudice that, drives a certain part of the population. So that's an example of a kind of policy that I think would be responsive.
The Democrats don't seem to be going in that direction, though. This is the mystery because,
Yeah.
we had 2016, and instead of saying, okay, these are legitimate things that need to be addressed, they've gone the other way. I mean, do you have any confidence that a Biden government that you're keen to see is going to move in that direction, for example, on immigration?
Unfortunately, it probably won't be the first item on the agenda. I mean, that I can only explain as a result of kind of the interest group politics within the Democratic Party, because you do have these very well-organized lobbies, pro-immigrant lobbies that are really opposed to, stronger enforcement of immigration laws. I don't exclude making one more go at, something like a comprehensive reform that might fix this problem. But, like a lot of things that need to be done, it's going to be costly in terms of political capital. And Biden's got so many items on the table that he probably is going to need to get to before he gets to this one. So I'm not sure that this is something he can pull off.
My worry is that if President Trump does lose, you're going to get a lot of people saying this was an aberration, Donald Trump was a bad egg, and we now need to return to where we were and continue on the arc of progress as we had previously understood it. And that I think would be damaging. And in your recent piece where you talked about the importance of this election and how you were so keen for Donald Trump to lose, there was no mention of that. There was no caution about triumphalism or...
Yeah, well,
I missed that.
Yeah, well, don't worry. If Biden actually wins, I think the conversation will shift to that very quickly. And he's got a lot of big strategic decisions to make because, particularly if the Democrats carry the Senate as well, there are going to be a lot of demands from the left wing of the party to move very quickly on an agenda that basically will lock in their advantage. And a lot of that, quite frankly, is stuff that probably should be done. I mean, the current American system really privileges Republicans, both in the Electoral College and in the Senate, and there are different ways of, fixing that. Plus which Republicans really shouldn't be allowed to get away with the kind of voter suppression that they've been attempting. But if that is the first item on the Democrats' agenda, it's going to be very polarizing. And I think what it'll do is kind of deepen, the existing resentments. Whereas there are other things that could be done, like a stimulus package that would, actually try to implement the kind of major infrastructure investments that Trump has been threatening for 4 years, but just never managed to get around to, where I think you'd actually get much broader support from parts of the right. And that's a choice that Biden will have to make. If I were him, I would go for the latter rather than, pushing for that kind of immediate political advantage. But, we'll have to see what happens.
Your position is quite a delicate one then. So you're for Biden until the day he's elected, and your priority then becomes defending sort of center-left Biden against the more kind of woke fundamentalists in the party. Is that Is that a
Yeah.
fair summary?
Yeah, I would say that my current position, I've moved, you know, reasonably far left on economic policy issues. So I think that in order to deal with the kind of rise in inequality, that you do need higher taxation on rich people. You need strengthening of social protections, especially the healthcare system. So I think they really do need to fix Obamacare and make sure that is actually something that works. But on the cultural issues, I think I'm probably going to be spending the next few years of a democratic dominance, fighting woke progressivism, because I think that's an area where things can easily get carried too far in terms of the kind of restrictions on free speech and the sort of anti-liberal tendencies of many people that believe that stuff.
It's quite a sort of narrow, vulnerable ground you're on. Then you're defending against a kind of identitarian right, and then as soon as you get them out, you're going to be defending against the identitarian left.
That's right. That's right. But I think that's the way, especially these kind of winner-take-all elections that we have in the U.S. and Britain. Unfortunately, that's the way the politics works. If we had, proportional representation or an Australian type alternative vote system, both parties could actually split into two. You could get a center right and then a kind of Tea Party, extremist right on the Republican side, and you could get a woke progressive and a centrist, Democratic Party. And the two centrist parts of those, of that new landscape could, ally, and that's where I would find my political home. But unfortunately, we've got a first past the post, voting system where it's either A or B, and once you move from B to A, the thing swings very dramatically.
What worries me is that what you're describing there sounds a lot like life before 2015. We had this with Tories and Labour, New Labour and a kind of liberal Tories very close to each other and pretty much dominating for many years. And we had a kind of similar thing in the US, and that's what people rejected. So I'm just sort of coming back to this idea. Is there not an alternative lesson here, which is that the true kind of Fukuyama philosophy, which is that actually those impulses are good and necessary, and that the kind of high technocratic liberalism doesn't really deal with them properly. So we need to rethink it.
No, but you're missing part of what I want to see done. I think that the part that really needs to be different really has to do with the economic policy part. One of the big problems with the old technocratic liberalism, as you describe it, was that it was very heavily into what's now called neoliberalism. That is to say, this very pro-market, anti-state, I would say ideology that grew up under Reagan and Thatcher that pushed both of the parties in the United States, and I would say, in Britain as well, towards a kind of consensus on this very, free market version of capitalism. And I think that had a lot of destructive effects. And so I think that we need to rethink that in a really serious way. I think that, in fact, this is something I've been trying to wrestle with, whether you can dethrone some of the ideas that have become so dominant, like the best outcome for everybody is just aggregate growth, no matter how that happens, that privileges consumers over producers. There's many things that I think need to be fundamentally rethought. And so I think that if you reconstruct a centrist liberal politics, it wouldn't be a return to the technocratic elites that brought you, China going into the WTO and this massive outflux of jobs and so forth. It would really be a really different set of economic policies. And then I think on the cultural front, it would involve a kind of renewed defense of, classical liberalism, where we really do want to protect diversity, but we don't want to, in a way, use that protection to, reduce the rights of people that don't agree with a certain identitarian consensus. So I don't think it's just a return to the old ideas that people had rejected.
At the very least, though, on the cultural front, if the lesson of the past 30 years is that these kind of impulses are there, and that if you try to suppress them or ignore them, they will come out in a dangerous way, isn't there a kind of argument to accommodate them better within the liberal politics? And perhaps the safest way to do that is a kind of benign nationalism. So maybe the nationalism of Brexit or Poland or Trump, can be part of the answer for kind of directing these energies.
I mean, that was one of the main points I tried to make in my identity book, that nationalism may be the wrong term. I mean, what I said is that every modern democracy needs a national identity, that you have to be committed to membership in a national community, that the nation still remains the basic building block of politics because that's where power is located. So, the European Union doesn't have an army, it doesn't have police. Power is really still held at the nation state level.
So that's a good thing. Can I just to say
that's good? Well, yes, I think
sounds like a Brexit argument.
No, nations can cooperate and they can delegate certain powers to transnational bodies, but ultimately, yes, they are the basic democratic building blocks of modern politics. And as long as that's true, you need to have a national identity, but that identity cannot be based on a kind of partial identity based on race or ethnicity or religion, because our modern societies are too de facto diverse for that. So they have to be built around ideas. And I thought that was the America that I had seen emerge after the civil rights era in the United States, where, when I was growing up, I remember my father always telling me, when somebody would say, well, where are you from? He said, well, you should say I'm an American, because being an American doesn't have a racial connotation. If your ancestors came from Japan, it doesn't matter, And, that's the kind of America that I grew up admiring, and I thought, we had really managed to achieve. And I think that, in the end, I just don't see an alternative for a modern democracy that is actually fairly diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, all these other characteristics. But I do think that nation is important, and you need to have loyalty that is to some extent irrational. You have to love, the basic founding ideas of your political system for that system to really work. And so that's what I think has been really missing on the left. A lot of people on the left interpret a kind of, they have a universalist belief in equality. And so it doesn't stop at national borders. Now, that's fine. But, the fact of the matter is that power really stops at national borders. And therefore, it's important to think about, continue to think about power in those national terms. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to take care of citizens of your community before you worry about people in Bangladesh or, Uganda or other places.
America first.
Well, the right kind of America first. I mean, quite honestly, the people that have pushed that, going all the way back to Charles Lindbergh in the 1930s, had a very specific version of America that they were defending. But, just like in your family, if you don't take care of your children and your parents before, other people's children and other people's parents, there's going to be something missing in your moral makeup.
So actually then, if each of these 3 or 4 examples we've talked about had been slightly different, you would be much more in favor of those populist movements.
There's all sorts of things that I've feel very badly that because Donald Trump has articulated something that I think is basically true, it discredits that position and it becomes much harder to, to say it. So, for example, he talks about the importance of borders, and I actually do think borders are important. I think that critical race theory is very, very deeply flawed. And I'm really sorry that he launched this official attack on the teaching of critical race theory, because now, everybody on the left side feels that they have to defend it because Trump has attacked it. So one out of every 100 things or so that come out of his mouth is actually something that is true that I agree with. So yes, that's right.
Was it, do you think, a missed opportunity then? Was there a kind of a better version of Trump that could actually have dealt with a lot of these things that you have been writing about for decades, without us now facing the danger of a kind of backlash or sort of reversion in too far the other direction?
It wasn't a missed opportunity. It actually was a big setback because, as I said, the fact that he has articulated certain positions that are actually correct ones, but him saying it has really deeply discredited them, and that's unfortunately not a good thing. I think if that same position had been taken by somebody that had much better credibility, that wasn't associated with all of these extremist positions, then you might have had a shift in the right direction. And so I think it's just going to take a long time to undo that damage.
Well, Francis Fukuyama, thank you so much for your time. And we'll see what happens in a week's time.
Okay, very good. Thanks for the talk.
That was Professor Francis Fukuyama joining us from Stanford in California. I was trying to persuade him to see if he might feel a little bit sad, at least in some small measure, if the end of the Trump era happens next Tuesday. I'm not sure that he quite said that, but we had a fascinating discussion nonetheless. So thank you for joining us. This was Lockdown TV from Unheard.